Welcome to our second installment of our summer series, Can't Win for Losing, The Crisis of the Working Poor. I'm so glad you're all here. The Riley Institute and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Furman have worked together to develop this series, and we're very proud of it and glad that you're here to share it with us. This fall will mark the 22nd year of learning in retirement at Furman University. Furman University Learning and Retirement, or Fuller, started in 1993 with about 65 members. Last year we had 1,600, so we've grown and we're very pleased with that. This fall we're offering 94 courses, 25 bonus events, and a lot of other programs. There's something for everyone. Our fall brochure is currently on our website. Paper copies are on the way. We'll have them hopefully here next week for you to pick up. If you're not already involved with OLLI, we'd love for you to check us out and find out more about us. As OLLI has grown, the variety of opportunities to learn has grown as well, and our members help create that growth. They bring new course ideas, they teach our classes, they create special interest groups, and they suggest one-day events. This program was a suggestion from one of our members. He had enjoyed a similar program at another university and brought the idea to us, and we thought, oh, this is a good idea. We formed a partnership with the Riley Institute to put this together and are so pleased to present the 4th annual summer series, Straight Talk South Carolina. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator, Mark Quinn, back to the stage to introduce part 2 of our summer series, Questioning the American Dream, Families and Neighbors Living on the Brink. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Good evening, everybody. Great to see you here on this Tuesday night, week 2 of our series, Straight Talk SC. For those of you who have cell phones, let me just remind you to please just take a moment, check it one time to make sure that it's off so we can give our guests our undivided attention here tonight. And for those of you who are extremely advanced with social media and you like to get on things like Twitter and tweet all day, well, you can tweet here. The hashtag is Straight Talk SC. So hashtag Straight Talk SC. If you want to tweet to me, my handle is @MarkQuinnSC. And maybe I can read some of your questions later when we get to the second part of our program. Just to remind everybody, of course, that last week we had Jessica Hennessy here. The title of the program was Who in South Carolina Gets to Live the American Dream? And I think a lot of people gained some great understanding from realizing exactly what poverty looked like, what the numbers look like in South Carolina, what you made or didn't make that put you in that particular bracket. So many thanks to Jessica, who was here tonight, for bringing us those numbers last week. And of course, we had that very extremely lively discussion between two state representatives, Gilda Cobb Hunter and Kenny Bingham, one from the left, one from the right, with two very disparate viewpoints of how do we bring people out of poverty, but yet thought it was very insightful to see how we could agree on the problem, but maybe not necessarily agree on the remedies to how to get people out of poverty. Before we talk about what's up tonight, let me tell you a little bit about week 3 and week 4. Next week, Chasing the American Dream. What does it take to climb the income ladder? I think you'll be fascinated by the results of Sarah Sotomayor, who works for the Pew Charitable Trust. It's one of the most outstanding organizations in research in America today. And just a couple of tidbits that I'll throw out from her. There's one stat that just went around last week from one of their studies. In Europe, people view economic mobility. 20% in Europe say it would be a result of working real hard, getting a leg up, pulling yourself up. 60% in Europe would believe that it's a matter of your fortune, where you're born in society. In America, those numbers are completely flipped. 60% believe that it's what you do with yourself that will get you ahead. Only 20% believe that it is where you were born. So that will be some interesting conversation. We'll also talk to two ladies, Tammy Hart and Dawn Dowden, who have told us about their very personal struggles living as among the working poor in here in South Carolina. Put a real face in what it means to be part of the working poor in our state. And finally, on August 12th, the last, we'll wrap up with some incredible things that are happening in Spartanburg right now. Former Mayor Bill Barnett and some other folks, Russell Booker, Superintendent of Schools, they're doing some fantastic things there to revitalize the downtown, but it takes an awful lot of work between so many disparate parties. What are they doing there to really make things happen in Spartanburg? You'll be fascinated by that conversation. conversation. We'll also hear from the just retired CEO of Costco. That corporation, of course, has decided to pay their employees much more than minimum wage. How is that working out for Costco? Has it put them at a competitive advantage or disadvantage? Has it caused them to lay off any employees? We'll be wanting to hear what he has to say about that. But first, tonight's session, and we'll start with Dr. Kyle Longest, who recently, and about 6-7 years ago, completed his degrees in history and sociology, both at Indiana and his PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research centers on how teens make the transition out of high school, focusing on substance abuse, religion, and academic behaviors. His work has appeared in journals such as Social Forces, Journal of Marriage and Family, Society and Mental Health, and Work and Occupations. He currently teaches courses on deviance, religion, research methods, quantitative analysis, the sociology of Harry Potter, and sports analytics. Please help me in welcoming Professor Kyle Longest of Furman University.
Thank you. First, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. And I'm going to ask for some participation from you all, so you're going to be a part of this. To set this up a little bit, though, what I'm going to focus on tonight is a sociological perspective to understanding poverty and the working poor. If you were here last week, you heard the amazing presentation by Dr. Hennessy from our economics department, and she focused a lot on the broad patterns and understanding poverty and those numbers across the United States and South Carolina. The sociological perspective seeks to extend that and take a slightly different approach by understanding how do those broad patterns create macro structural constraints on individuals' lives. Now, most people, when they think about the decisions that people make, they think about their individual situations. But what sociology wants to do and what the sociological perspective seeks to do is to understand how these structural properties, and we're going to see some examples of those tonight, constrain and provide opportunities for individuals. So to understand individual decisions, we need to understand how they are making those decisions within those structural constraints, because those constraints are going to directly influence their life outcomes and chances. And so that's what we're going to kind of focus on tonight. Now, to get started, what I'm going to have you do is I think one of the best ways to try and understand this sociological perspective is to do our best to put ourselves in those people's shoes, to try and understand how are they making those decisions within these structural constraints. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to get into small groups of 2, 3, maybe even 4 people sitting around you. So just create small little groups, look to the people to your left and right, 2 or 3. You're going to work with them for just a few minutes. You should also have a note card. Each group needs a note card. It should be on a seat next to you and something to write with. 2, 3, 4, just a couple people to talk to. Okay? Everybody have a little group, some folks to talk with? Okay? All right. So now, I want to congratulate you because your small group is a family. This wasn't in the tweets that you were going to be a part of a new family when you came to tonight's talk, but you are. And specifically, you're a family of 3 living in Greenville, South Carolina. And this is a somewhat typical situation. Your family consists of a single mother and 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. So that's your family. I'm going to have you make some decisions based on this context that you're in. Now, one nice thing about your family is, although you are a single mother, which presents some challenges which we'll talk about, you have a job. You have a full-time job. And that's not a given these days. But you are fortunate enough to have a full-time job, working 40 hours a week. The downside is that it's a minimum wage job. So let me ask, what is the minimum wage in South Carolina? Okay. Somewhat of a trick question. Sorry. There actually is no minimum wage law in the state of South Carolina. South Carolina is one of 5 states, you see a trend in the other states there, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, that have no minimum wage law. That means if the federal government decided to change their minimum wage and repeal their minimum wage, there would actually not be any minimum wage in the state of South Carolina. But as things stand now, we default to the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour. Okay, so that's what you're going to make an hour. So if we think about this, if you're working 40 hours a week, what are you making in a week on a minimum wage salary in South Carolina? Anyone really good at math? $290 a week. $290 a week is what you make. We're going to deal with gross. We're not going to deal with taxes right now. I'll leave that to the economics department, okay? We're just going to make it pretty simple here. What this also means is you make about $1,275 for a month, and depending on how we do different months and when you work and those sorts of things, about $15,000 for a year. Okay, that's what you make on a minimum wage salary, where the federal government says this is what you can make it on. I just want to point out, and again, if you were here last week, you've heard this, for a family of 3, even using, as Dr. Hennessy talked about, a suspect definition of poverty and where we set that poverty line in this country, you are well below it. To be out of poverty in this country, with a family of 3, you need to be making almost $20,000. You're not even close to that. Even if you were a family of 2, if you were a single mother with a child, or a dual or a spousal pair, and one working and one not, you would still be below the poverty threshold, which is outdated and has all kinds of problems. But this is a situation you're in. So what I'm going to have you do, what I would like to have you do, is based on this monthly budget, we're going to do it for 1 month, $1,276. In your family, I would like you to do a budget for 1 month. Where are you going to spend your money, and how are you going to spend it? And I want you to think about your real family. What all do you have to spend in 1 month, and how are you going to make $1,276 work for your family? Okay? Take some time, 5 to 10 minutes here, and I want you to really think about how are you going to spend your money to the exact dollar amount. How much are you going to spend on all the things your family needs? Go ahead. Let me know if you have any questions. Okay. Good question. Okay, I'm going to hold you up for just 1 second, okay? Sorry to stop the discussion right away, but I had a question and I want to talk about it. And the question was, are we allowing for any assistance programs to calculate into this? So let's talk about this just for a second and whether we qualify. First off, does anyone know, do you qualify for any direct government assistance? Okay, we qualify for some. What exactly do you qualify for? Okay, we have a general sense of what we qualify for. Okay, I notice some people are still maybe not quite sure. One of the most direct forms of assistance that people think about would be a program that actually changed in 1996, 97. We changed from AFDC to TANF. We're currently under TANF. Your family, this would be the most direct assistance, putting aside like credits and housing credits and things like this. Direct income assistance would come from TANF. You can tell the difference in the name. We started with aid to families with dependent children. We have now moved to temporary assistance for needy families. The name actually says a lot about the changes in the programs. And there were 2 key changes. There were a lot, but there are 2 that I want to focus on. Does anyone know what one of them was? Perfect. The first one is, notice the move to temporary. That is not in AFDC. There is a 60-month lifetime maximum. That is, over the course of your life, you can draw on TANF for 60 total months. You have 2 kids. If you start drawing on it, when can you stop? When they're 5. Let's hope that you're in a better situation. Because at the end of 5 years, you can't draw on anymore. What's the second major change that TANF introduced? Does anyone know? I think I heard it. You have to be engaged in work activities. This is really broadly defined. I'm not getting into all the nuances here. But you have to be engaged in some type of work activities to qualify for TANF. What I want to highlight here, now notice, this is a great example of a structure. These programs provide a structure that people in these situations operate under. This was outside their control. They didn't make this decision, but now their choices are constrained, their decisions are constrained by this structure. And there are two key assumptions I want to see in these changes. The first one is this idea of temporary. Why do you think they made it temporary? What was the idea behind that? That's right. Right? You make it temporary because the idea is if you make it temporary, that's going to force them off welfare. And specifically, meaning force them off assistance, what are you going to push them into? And this gets at the second one. Work. So what's the assumption? Exactly. If you're in work, then you're not in poverty. That's the idea here. Those are two fundamental assumptions that this program takes, and we're going to see in just a bit whether that makes sense. I also just want to point out that there are some other restrictions. You can only make so much money. You do technically qualify. But notice what happens. You can make $329 a week. If you're a cent over that, you don't qualify. So let's say you work really hard at work. You're making minimum wage. You get a raise. So now you're getting an extra $1 an hour, an extra $40 a week. Guess what? You don't qualify. You don't qualify anymore. It also decreases, these limits decrease after 6 months. Again, the assumption is if you're working, you shouldn't need this assistance. You can see the maximum you can ever receive would be $216 a month. Now you're working, you're bringing in money, so you're not going to get $216 a month. I'm going to add $100. It's actually, if you ever have the time, you can go online, you can put in numbers and see. The first thing you'll realize, and I noticed this when I did it, how complicated it is to figure out exactly what you're owed under TANF. But you can do it. I'm going to give you an extra $100 to add to your income. Okay, so you have an extra $100. Now, one other program, well, I want to confront, or I want to come back to this idea of does this change from AFDC to TANF and what that means. So we're going to compare here the last year-ish under AFDC to TANF. In terms of families, there's about 119,000 families. This is in the state of South Carolina that were considered being in poverty, remembering all the things that we've talked about in terms of how we define in poverty. In 2010, 2011, that number, not surprisingly, after the recession, jumped. And it went up to 135,000 families in growth and those sorts of things. In terms of the number of families that were on AFDC in 1994, you can see here we had about almost 50,000. With the new restrictions that were put in place in TANF, that number, even though those in poverty dramatically increased, the number that were receiving assistance through TANF dramatically decreased. Such that the ratio that we were providing support to in the state, this is South Carolina, went from 42%, nothing great, to 15%. And we're not even keeping track with the rest of the country. That you can see across the country, it was never great. It's still better than South Carolina. Now, the last one, I'm going to go through this one kind of quickly because I want to give you some opportunity to really deal with this. But this is the other one that you might have heard of that you would qualify for, and this is SNAP. This is directly based on food. There are restrictions on what you can use this for, but this is for supplemental food, supplemental nutrition assistance program. And one thing that I want to point out here is that, again, we see an income limit that is a little bit higher. What's interesting is, again, there are all these deductions. You can take medical deductions, you can take dependent care deductions, child support deductions, you can take excess shelter deductions. The formula, again, you can look this up, is unbelievably complicated just to figure out how much you actually can make or how much you can take from this. The other interesting thing here is if you have $2,000 in assets in a bank account, if you've saved, you have $2,000, you no longer qualify for SNAP. Why not? You have money, so you can buy food. Again, this is a structure. I have to make a decision. Am I going to save and potentially lose this benefit or not? That's a decision that you have to make. You can see the maximum, again, you can get $500. That's if you had zero income. The way you calculate how much you get, it has to do on your income and a certain percentage. Again, a little difficult exactly with all these deductions. I'm going to give you an extra $200 that has to be applied directly to food because SNAP goes directly to food. So you get an extra $100 just straight cash from TANF if you decided this is one of your 60 months you're going to use it for, and you can also have an extra $200 to use on food, right? Now, take some time, go through your budget. Where are you going to spend money? What are you going to spend it on? How much are you going to spend? Go ahead, take about 5 minutes or so, and we will talk about some of the decisions that you're making in these constraints. Okay. Let's take some time to talk about some of the decisions you made to help us understand again. What we're looking at here is how the constraints we're under, these structural constraints that we're under, how they impact the decisions that we have to make and the trade-offs, the consequences that we face when we make those decisions, and how they impact our potential life outcomes or our kids' life outcomes. Now, I'm going to ask as we go through this, if you don't mind raising your hand, just so we can hear everybody, do your best to speak up. We might have some microphones going around. So let's just get started. What's the first thing you decided to take care of? Rent. Very good. Rent is what we decided to take care of. What'd you budget for rent in Greenville, South Carolina? 700, 600? Okay. Okay, this is interesting. We're going to come back to this. So I'm hearing numbers like 600, 700, 500. Notice if we went with those options, what happens to your budget? You're at half. You're at half. So we make a choice. We went a third, like around 400 or something like that. Now there are other options: low-income housing, subsidized housing. Okay, this is a structural constraint. Now let's think about this. You have to make a choice. Do I spend almost a half of my budget, even a third of my budget on rent, or do I take this other option? What's one potential consequence if we go towards the low-income housing, subsidized housing option? What's that? Okay. Which, notice a lot of you talked about, you're on a pretty tight budget. And if those numbers change, just the mental stress that puts you under from month to month. What's another consequence that we might have here? What do you mean, bad neighborhood? Very good. What's a negative consequence of that for your children?
They won't grow up being as positive as they could be.
Very good. They're surrounded by crime, and what we know that does for them. Maybe it's going to have a potential effect on them. There's enough research that suggests there's going to be a consequence. What about let's make it even more micro. Let's even think about your family. What type of apartment are you probably going to have? 2-bedroom. Notice we have to make a decision. Do we spend a little more to get a 3rd bedroom, or do we keep our budget down and go to a 2-bedroom? Okay, so we're going to make that trade-off. We're going to go to a 2-bedroom place. What is a potential negative consequence that comes from making that very sensible or a logical decision? What's it?
Bedrooms for different sexes.
Okay.
So
somebody's going to have to sleep together. Even if we think about a same-sex situation here. So let's say we decide to put the 7 and the 3-year-old together. What's a negative consequence of that? Even if it was the same sex. Let's say just for the moment it's same sex, so that's what you decide to do. They don't get along. They're going to fight a lot. Very good. Now, I want to repeat this. What she said was, now, some people are far removed. I have a 3.5-year-old and I have a 1.5-year-old, so almost getting to 2. They don't sleep so well, right? They keep me up, and I'm not in the same room. So we have to think about, what does this mean for the 7-year-old having to share a bedroom with a 2-year-old who's getting up in the middle of the night, who's disruptive, who's maybe waking up still around 4:35 in the morning? That's when I'm up, right? And so what is that going to do? The child's going to go to school tired, out of it, disrupted sleep. So your other option is you put the 2-year-old with you. So now what happens? You're tired, and you're going to work tired, and you're going to work disorientated. And that's going to cause a problem for whether you're able to hold on to your job or not. So we see here just right away these kind of decisions, and it seems like, well, we've got to have 3 bedrooms, but we can't. So then we make a trade-off, and that either affects us and our performance at work, or it affects our children and their performance at school. All right, so I'm going to somewhat split the difference. I just want to kind of keep a running total here. So I'm going to somewhat split the difference, and I'm going to go with at 400. I'm going to somewhat lowball this, and I'm going to go with 400. I heard that. I heard some numbers around that. So we'll go with 400. Notice, again, we're about a third of our budget here. Pardon? Well, I'm just going to kind of go. We make the decision. We want to we want to be in a certain neighborhood. We're going to go with a 2-bedroom place. So this is just a rough estimate. Obviously, these are going to be different for different families, but we can see again, just as an illustration of the different decisions and trade-offs we're getting here. What's the second item on your budget? Food. Very good. What do we budget for food? 400 plus the 200, or just 400 total? So you're going to contribute 200 plus the 200 from from SNAP program. Okay. Let's think about this. So we're going to spend a total of $400 on food. To make that work, what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to buy potentially a lot of fast food. No? What are we going to do instead? Okay, we're going to have to buy generic. Now, wait. We're going to buy generic. What type of generic foods are we talking about? Processed foods. Which costs more? Which costs more? A processed meal, or to buy all the ingredients that go into that processed meal? Okay, we can buy canned vegetables. We can. Okay? But in terms of nutritional value, are we making trade-off? Which would we rather buy? Fresh fruits and meats? Okay. Very good. We can't afford that. We can't afford that. So let's just walk this through for a second. To make our budget work on a $400 food budget, and again, there are options, there are food pantries. We're actually going to come back to how this might be an issue in just a second. Okay? We'd make this work, we're going to have to make some trade-offs. As much as we know that fresh foods and those sorts of things are going to be better for our family, we have to make some trade-offs. We have to add some process. We have to do some nights of fast food. What's one negative consequence of that? Health for who? Everybody. What's a potential negative consequence for your 7-year-old? Very good. One, we might be talking about getting sick more frequently, which is going to do what to their schooling? It's going to decrease it. They're going to miss a lot more. How else might it impact their schooling? Healthcare costs, which we see again. We make one trade-off, and that leads to a consequence which is going to maybe tighten our budget even more. We know that when children are eating more processed foods, less fresh vegetables and meats, that leads to obesity. We also know that it affects their energy. So when we look at students from low-income families in school and they seem to be disengaged or out of it, it could be, one, sleeping with a younger sibling and not getting the best nutritional value. But these are choices we want to make. Now, I want to draw your attention to one thing. If you remember back, the maximum you could get from SNAP was $520. That is what the government calls the thrifty food budget. And we're going to try and make it on $126 less dollars. And that's what you're trying to do. Now, you're right. I just heard someone said you have to get creative. But we see here every time we get creative and make one choice, we might lead ourselves into negative consequences in another choice. Right? And there are ways we can do it. But we want to see how that impacts the kinds of decisions and outcomes we have. So, okay, so we have food. Again, I think I heard 200 plus the 200, so that's we're going to stay low here. Notice, from our 1576, we're already at 800. We've halved it. We've halved it already, and we've taken care of two things. What's the next thing? Okay, this is where we start to, interesting to see where people go here. Before we go to childcare, what do you have to take up? You have a job. Transportation, very good. We got to think about transportation. What were some of the options within these constraints that you thought about in terms of transportation? Bus. Okay. Why are we going with the bus? Cheapest. All right. What are some concerns in Greenville, South Carolina with using a bus? All, very good routes. How many times just go to Walmart, right up here in Travelers Rest, count how many buses you see, right? Now this is where we want to think about this structure. Now that seems like the logical choice. But with the housing budget we have, what's a decision we've had to make? What's a trade-off we're going to have to make that might impact our ability, even with the limited nature of public transportation in Greenville, that might hinder our ability to rely on public transportation? Location. Now let's think about this. Who decides where the bus routes go? Right? So look, this is where we come back. Every decision we make within these structural constraints is going to feed off each other. So we make a decision with rent to live in a certain area. Public transportation isn't accessible. The other aspect here, let's say it is. We are fortunate, it's there, we can use it. With your family, why is relying solely on public transportation problematic? Very good. What if our kid gets sick? What if our kid gets in trouble? What if our kid wants to participate in an extracurricular activity that doesn't happen to line up perfectly with the bus schedule? Think about yourself. What could be problematic for your situation in relying on public transportation? What's that? Shift work. Okay, what else? Late buses. You have 2 kids. You have a 2-year-old. I think getting a 2-year-old ready at a particular time should be an Olympic sport. Because it is hard. So you're 2 minutes late because your kid wants to wear his blue socks and not his red socks and wants to wear a different set of superhero underwear that day, then you're in trouble and you're going to be late to work. And what happens if you're late to work a day or 2 each week? You're done because you're easy to lay off. You're hourly. You're done. So this is a great question, okay? This is a great question. This often comes up with the rent example too. Maybe we could stay with family. What is the assumption there? That there is some, they're nearby, and they're in a different situation. That they're in a different situation that you are. This is actually, I think, going to come up next. So transportation, let me follow this through. I want to come back to the family in just a second. I think it's going to come up in the next item I heard. So what's the other option with transportation? Car. We got to use a car. Let's say you somehow have a car. What does that add to our budget now? Insurance, gas, what else? Taxes. We got to keep it up. Something goes wrong. I mean, you're starting to see, even after only 2 items, that we're getting pretty tight. And you have the brakes go out, the transmission goes out, you got new tires, you just need an oil change. You're going to see how that's really difficult. So transportation right away becomes a problem. Now, I'm not going to go through exactly how much insurance costs. I think this is always interesting, of course, most likely what kind of car are you going to have? Used and old. And what's that going to do to your insurance rates? It's actually going to go up, typically. Having an older car typically is seen as being higher risk. Sometimes it's going to be dependent. It's going to be, yeah.
But 25% of the people in South Carolina don't have insurance.
Very good. Now, okay, this is a choice we can make, right? But what's the trade-off there? Very good. If something happens, we are going to be in a worse situation. But this is great. I really like this example because this is where people often say, oh, they don't have insurance. How can you not have insurance? Just have insurance. Look at the structural constraints we're under. We have to make choices. We have to make choices about food. We have to make choices about where we live. We have to make choices about who's going to watch our kids. And then we have to make choices about insurance, where does that fall? So we just want, again, the point here, we're not trying to evaluate decisions. We're trying to understand them within particular structural contexts. And that's what we're trying to do. So I'm going to say we do need some form of transportation, given where our job is. Again, thinking about rent, we talked about the place that you live and where we decide the public transportation is going to go and how that lines up in creative structure. I'm going to, again, keep it pretty low, and I'm going to add gas and everything in here. What, maybe if I went really low, like 150, something like that. Maybe 100? No, too low? Yeah, okay, let's do 2 then. I don't want to make it infeasible, but we're going to see. The next thing I heard was daycare. The next thing I heard, we got to take care of our kid. We've got a 2-year-old. And notice this is also during the summer. So we've also got to think about the 7-year-old, but we're going to kind of make it somewhat generic. So we're going to deal with a 2-year-old. What are our choices for daycare? Neighbor, family. What does that assume? They're there and not doing what? Working. Everyone says, I'll leave them with grandma. That assumes that grandma's in a situation where she's not working. Let's say we are in a nice place where that's true, where we have a grandma who's willing to watch our kids, is not having to work herself, and so we can leave her. How is that potentially problematic for us? That's a choice, but we want to see the trade-offs. It makes sense in the structural context, but what are the potential trade-offs here? Okay, very good. The point, what she said was, this is a whole nother discussion. There's whole things we could get into here. But the trade-off between being with an individual as opposed to potentially being in a center or some type of environment where there is some type of instruction, some type of school preparedness going on. And what's going to happen to those children when they get into their first year of schooling, not having been there before. That's one potential. Now, again, there are different routes, but that's one potential. What's another potential trade-off we're making if we happen to have a family member that we can rely on? Very good. Grandma gets sick. What do you have to do? And what happens if you have to keep calling in sick from work? You're going to lose your job. Okay? Now, we have to make a choice. We have to make a choice within our structural constraints. Let's say we try and go with some form of daycare. What do we think? Anyone do this option? Anyone toss out some numbers? $400, right? $300. That's just very good. That's just the 2-year-old. That's just a 2. What are we doing with the 7-year-old during the school year or during the summer? Okay, now this is great. This is great. I want to kind of keep us going here just a little bit. I'm going to say with daycare or childcare, that we're going to spend $250. Okay, I know that's low. But I just want to go through some of the other things that we could think about. What was the next item on your budget? Utilities. What did you include when you thought utilities? What did you include? Okay, electricity. Gotta have that. Water. Maybe we're in a place where that's included. Maybe, probably not. Okay. If we put electricity and heat together, did you include anything else in your utilities? Telephone. Okay. Some people think, oh, do we really need a telephone? Why do we have to have a telephone? We've got kids, communicate with school. We've got work. We've already talked about how many scenarios where we might need to miss work. If we don't call them, we're not even going to have a job to go back to, right? It is more practical to have a cell phone now, which is going to cost. Now, there are programs that have been established. Someone said cable. No. Okay. Why might a family in this situation, that to some people seems like maybe that's a luxury. But what is happening now? Someone said this. If you're paying $250 for childcare, what's happening to the 7-year-old during the school year? What time do they probably get off school? There are after-school programs. How are they going to get there? Some stay in the school, but then we got to think about how are we going to get them. We've talked about shift work. Again, you see, look, I'm not trying to say that there's one answer here, but we want to see the trade-offs we make. Let's say we don't have an accessible after-school program that works for our child. Why might cable not be a luxury for us? Remember, we already talked about where are we living. So our choices are we send them outside in a potentially dangerous environment. What probably is not in our neighborhood that might be helpful for a kid who has to come home alone? A library, a park, some green space. Now, Greenville, I will say, probably does better than this in some places. But again, think about who's making the decisions about where these things go. And go into some of the neighborhoods where we're talking about having to live under these kinds of housing conditions and what you're going to do with your kids. We can think about this, but again, we see it as, oh, of course cable's a luxury. But then we think about, well, the constraints that we're under, that decision starts to turn a little bit and it starts to be interpreted potentially differently. It could be interpreted differently. Another big one here is the internet. Oh, well, we don't need that. We can go to the library, all these sorts of things. I talked to students today. Communication from schools, almost completely through email. Programs or projects they have to do through email. When I ask my students how many applied for college or research colleges online, every single hand goes up. So even something like the internet that seems like a luxury, when we think about our kids and the potential negative consequences if we don't make that decision, what that means for them. Okay? And the long-term effect, notice, I'm going to skip through, I'm running short on time, I'm going to skip through. What didn't you get in your budget that you would have liked to have? We haven't talked about medical. We haven't talked about clothes. What else isn't in your budget? School supplies. This is the one. One, anything that might be seen as entertainment. Think about the mental stress that you're under. You can maybe make it work for a month. You can maybe make it work for 2. But month after month, your kids, you go to McDonald's or you take them to a movie just because, you know what, they've been good kids, but we don't have room there. Think about it. It's the summer. It happens to be hot that month. What happens to your electricity? When you start to get down to it, if you did it all the way out, you're probably within $10, $20. The last thing that someone brought up that I'll just touch on here is savings. Savings. Do we have room for savings? So again, when we hear this talk about, oh, these people, they can't save because all they do is spend money. In these constraints, savings is a different idea. Right? Again, what I want to highlight here, what I really want to highlight for you is these decisions that we see people making, we need to understand them within the structural constraints that they're under. And they have to make choices. Those choices are going to have trade-offs. They're going to have consequences. Some are going to provide opportunities. Some are going to provide long-term negative outcomes for their children and for their families. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I hope that it was insightful.
Kyle, they're extremely insightful, a useful exercise as well to put pen to paper and figure out exactly how little some people have to deal with month to month. And let me just make one point real quick. Last week I brought up this woman that I had first interviewed when I was at ETV 6 years ago, and I became interested in this process, and she went with me through her entire monthly budget. She worked at the unnamed fast food restaurant there in Columbia and showed me that check stub, $385 at the first of the month. $385 in the first of the month, because we had these conversations about people that pay taxes, don't pay taxes. Everybody pays a payroll tax if you're out there working. They don't pay, income tax at the end of the year because they don't make enough, but they do pay taxes. In the conversation, what really hit me at the time, I was having my first son. She goes, I've got these 2 kids, and up until now, it has been okay after school because we had the community center down the street. After the recession of 2008, what were some of the first things to go? Community centers, social services, things that in Columbia at the General Assembly, it's not maybe heartless, it's just one of those things, this line item, well, we can afford those in good times. In tough times, those would be the first things to go. The most crucial safety net for a lot of people. Just keep that in mind as you continue to put that pen to paper. When we come back, we're going to hear a fascinating story from a pediatrician, public health expert from the city of Richmond, who decided 10 years ago with his wife to move to the most challenging, impoverished, blighted part of the city of Richmond. Why would he do that, and what has he learned in the 10 years since? That's what Dr. Danny Avula is going to tell us when we come back after a 15-minute break.